Okay, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Craig McConnell. I haven't seen if Craig is here, so hopefully he is. The floor is yours, Craig.
Do you want to start even though we're a couple minutes early? You want to start even though we're a couple minutes early?
Yeah, we'll keep doing, yeah. Thank you.
All right, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for staying who is here. I closed out the World Buiatrics Congress in Cannes a couple years ago, and I think there were 3 people. So this is a fantastic audience, and I appreciate that. All right, so what I'm talking about today looks complicated, and I've tried to sort of tweak it a little bit so that we will actually get into some practical aspects of it. And we have a lot to cover, so sort of hang on. I'm going to cruise through a bit of information to try to set up the stage to the final punchline, all right? So at the end of the day, this is actually building on what we started at the last Buiatrics Congress, actually, and that was to set up a survey. And the idea is to try to assess the effectiveness of dairy health systems with a focus on legitimate assessments of disease, mortality, and removals that are consistent and integrated, and focusing on the right kind of animal health actions to reduce preventable deaths and diseases, focusing on cost and welfare, and sort of mixing those 2 things together. So I really appreciated Hank's talk earlier. I think that he hit on some stuff that I should hopefully get at myself, but in a much more finite way. So ultimately, I love the focus on failure. That is where my focus has been the last few years. I, for the most part, have looked at mortality on dairies. And over the course of probably the last 10 years, realistically, looking at mortality on dairies in adult cows predominantly, we came to the conclusion that we need to do a better job of really targeting what those outcomes are to get beyond pathology and to try to focus on actually the sequence of events that leads to a pathology. So I'm going to show you a couple dead cows. So at the end of the day, we've got a cow like this, which has hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, a very straightforward conclusion. Very easy to categorize. On the other hand, we can have cases like this one that was a raging peritonitis, go back, raging peritonitis, possibly multifactorial. You get into the heart of the matter, you find that it had a rumen perforation. The rumen perforation was actually due to a roll and toggle that went wrong. And so ultimately, in order to categorize a cow like this, from the perspective of what caused that death, you're left with a whole sequence of events to try to get your head around. Because the bottom line with a cow like this is she actually had metabolic issues. She had a displaced abomasum. She had transition cow failure. She ultimately had a DA. That DA ultimately led to a surgical technique, roll and toggle, which ultimately went poorly, which ultimately killed her. So where do you categorize that cow in order to actually capture information that you can use down the track? Okay, so my focus over the course of years, like I said, has been primarily on dead cows. And so we came to the conclusion that what we needed to do on dairies was model something similar to what we've done with humans in terms of human death certificates. And we came up with a dairy death certificate that ultimately focuses on a final mortality code, with the final mortality code being developed on the back of underlying, intermediate, and immediate causes of death. It's the same thing that human death certificates use, and it ultimately gives you the full gamut of information that led up to that individual's death. All right, so a lot of information captured in a final code. I'm not going to get into that today. That's a whole other presentation. But it gets to the heart of the matter in that you are trying to do a lot more with information from a dead cow than just focus on that pathology. All right, so based on the back of that, I've become very interested in human medical epidemiology and what do human medical epidemiologists do with health issues that we don't do on dairies, and what could we potentially emulate in order to do a better job of capturing these sequences of events that lead to something. Ultimately, this is getting into some economics, and I'll sort of touch on that at the very end, but predominantly, this is all about just capturing the information to do something with in the long term from a herd health perspective, okay? So summary measures of population health are sort of a byword within human medical epidemiology. The idea is to combine information on mortality and non-fatal health outcomes to represent the health of a particular population. Within that, the human disability adjusted life year, the DALI, you can see where I'm going with this with our DALact as we call it now, so the disease adjusted lactation we're calling it, we're basically mimicking the DALI, is a time unit of measure for health issues, okay? So the concept is basically you capture the time that an animal is in ill health and tie that, or a human, and tie that to the time that an animal loses, or a human, to premature death. And that's a key point, because this is where a sticking point oftentimes happens when I'm having this conversation with vets and dairy farm workers, as well as dairy farm managers and dairy owners. At the end of the day, we're trying to combine time lived with a disability, or in our case, a disease in most cases, or injuries, and time lost to premature mortality and culling. So what does that actually mean? Because the argument can be had that premature culling is all over the gamut. So for the purposes of this talk, what we're talking about is premature culling is referring to a culled cow that you didn't have the choice to make. She was biological, she was forced, however you want to classify that. Involuntary, biological, force are all basically the same concept. You didn't have the choice as a veterinarian or a farm manager or a farm owner to get rid of that cow. She had to leave because she was sick, and mortality obviously is in most cases premature. That said, sometimes cows need to be put down, so that becomes a whole other concept, euthanasia versus natural death. At the end of the day, if a cow dies, we're considering it premature mortality. As we go through this talk, you're going to be thinking that premature mortality should be possibly weighted based on age, and it undoubtedly should, and so when you get to the economic side of this whole conversation, that becomes part of the conversation. Okay, so what do we do with this? We're ultimately trying to mimic the DALI. We're called this the disability or the disease-adjusted lactation is actually what we're calling it, and what you're trying to do is accomplish a record of the days lost to illness, so that's antemortem, but ultimately impacting the cow from a health perspective, and days lost to removal or death that you had no choice in. The DLI, that days lost to illness, is a component of it is a disability weight, and it's ultimately multiplied by a duration so that you come up with the impact of that disease in terms of time, okay? So what I'm meant to be talking about today is ultimately this concept of the time lost during the disability, not necessarily the death, but I'm going to tie those all together here towards the end. So what we're focused on is you've got animals that, and we're just focusing on a lactation for the time being. You've got animals that interparturition, they have some level of diseases, whether that's infectious, metabolic, injury, or otherwise. Those can potentially lead to a sequela. And at the end of the day, you have the combination of factors that impacts that animal and creates a time lost to disease, right? So that's our focal point. That said, over the course of time, what we'd really like to focus on is going beyond just a lactation and look at the whole sequence of events across a lifetime. That's down the track. At the moment, we're just focused on lactations, okay? So we did a survey, and I really, really have to thank whoever helped with this survey, because I think there are a few of you here that probably did that. We set this up at the last World Buiatrics Congress. We had ultimately 96 participants. We considered it an expert opinion survey. We targeted practitioners, veterinary practitioners, as well as farm managers or farm owners with dairy experience. We had 96 participants in the end. They were international, 85, however, from North America. The others were from outside of North America. 79 were from veterinarians. The others were owners and or managers. And we had 79 who had more than 5 years of experience within the dairy industry as a whole. Okay, so 96 overall participants. We asked them to rank 12 diseases using pink eye as a model, and our other 12 diseases are here, from least impactful to most impactful, least impactful essentially being nothing, most impactful being death, and the most likely severity as well. So minimum, maximum, most likely, okay? We did some other bits and pieces in this survey that were much more complicated and led to a higher dropout rate, and I'm not going to talk about those today, but for those of you who helped out with the survey, you might recall unhappily some of those other aspects. So what did we do with this data? We did BetaPERT distributions. I'm not a statistician. I had lots of help with this aspect of it, but what we ultimately did with these distributions is looked at them individually, which are the single lines here, and we looked at them as a combined distribution, which is this heavier set line here. On the x-axis, you have impact, so that's really just the severity. So what was the severity score from 0 to 10? And the peak on that, which is called the density in this case, is really just telling you whether or not the respondents had a uniform answer in the sense that they felt comfortable saying that the spread of that disease from minimum to maximum wasn't much. So a higher density ultimately means that people were really comfortable saying this particular disease sort of falls within this smaller range, okay? So for retained placenta, although you can see a fairly broad spectrum of individual answers, what we ultimately had was a real shift to the left, and when you looked at means and medians, that ultimately fell far on, to the, well, not far, but to the left of the midline, okay? as composed to something like a right displaced abomasum, which had a serious shift to the right. Of course, within this, you can see that there were also sort of some lag time, a left bent to the whole line that ultimately says that people weren't necessarily fully comfortable with it being a highly impactful disease, but by and large, we start leaning to the right, okay? Compare that to something like these three. So I'm not going to show you all of these because I just wanted to kind of touch on what we did with this data. But we ultimately had 3 classifications, calving trauma, lameness, and musculoskeletal injury, that showed something like this. Look at this out here, if I can get it. Something like this. At the end of the day, when you look at something like this, you see total lack of consensus, basically. It's falling totally in the middle. Nobody's really comfortable to say that there's a tight spread. Nobody's necessarily comfortable to say whether it was left or right. And ultimately, what you're dealing with is a classification, in this case, calving trauma, which indicates that it is far too generalized. So for those 3 particular diseases that we focused on, calving trauma, lameness, and musculoskeletal injury, using classifications that we tend to find in the records that we work with, we absolutely need to redefine those from a more specific, unique aspect to get more clarity in terms of what those diseases represent. Fine. For the moment, we have these representative classifications, and this is what we're going to use. And when you think about it, something like musculoskeletal injury can represent anything from some nerve damage, potentially, to something like this. And in a case like this is exactly the kind of case that ultimately made us think that we need things like a death certificate. This is the back of a cow, completely destroyed and septic. The rest of the cow was essentially septic. This cow died of stupidity, more or less, because she was a crazy cow that liked to run underneath the freestall bars, and we couldn't stop her from doing that. And she ultimately damaged her back to such an extent that we couldn't get on top of the infection. And so what do you classify that as? Is it musculoskeletal injury? Is it something deranged within the cow? Is it management because the freestall bars were too low, too high, et cetera? So these are the kinds of cases that are hard to classify, but ultimately you're trying to capture some information about what that ultimate global causality, in this case musculoskeletal injuries, can lend toward the conversation of the impact of disease. Okay, so we got our individual disability weights from the severity scores. Essentially all we did was take the severity score, divide it by 10, and we ultimately had some number of 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, et cetera, that we could multiply by a duration, and that becomes a whole other conversation that I'm not going to get into too much right now. But ultimately, you have to have a disease duration estimation during the active phase of disease that you multiply these by so that you can come up with an estimation of the time lost during that period of disease. We put these into classes because at the end of the day, having things like a 0.4 versus a 0.37 doesn't do us much good. So we put them into classes 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, and we use those to try to tell a story about a given disease, okay? So I'm just going to use diarrhea as a representation using some data from one of our farms. Using the disability weight of a 0.4, we estimate that on average cows, these are adult cows, with diarrhea have roughly 2 days of active diarrhea. The days in milk lost per case, if we're using time in terms of days in milk, is 0.4 times the 2, so we end up with 1 day lost per case of diarrhea. Ultimately, if we have a herd with a prevalence of 4% per lactation, we have a 1,000 cow herd, we have 40 cows affected times 1 day of lost productivity per cow for 40 days of milk lost if we're looking across lactations. So that's kind of how you use this metric. Compare that to something like mastitis. Disability weight of 0.5, we're going to say an average duration of 5 days. Ultimately, you end up with 2.5 days lost. You have a prevalence of 23% in your herd. You end up with 230 cows affected, 575 days in milk lost. Okay, so that's kind of the concept here. What does this active phase of disease lead to in terms of time lost? And then, of course, with that time lost, you can start having a whole other conversation about the cost loss. And so what does that ultimately impact you? How does that ultimately impact you in terms of economics? That said, and that's basically the summation of what we're doing with the disability weights, this conversation cannot end with that because you have to take into account those forced, biologic, involuntary, whatever you want to call them, cullings. If you don't take those into account, you're missing the time lost to those cows that you ultimately had no choice over. So if we use something like diarrhea again, these numbers might not necessarily fit in everybody's production units, but bear with me because this is some data that we have pulled out from one of our herds. 25% annual culling, 1% of those culls were attributed to diarrhea. 1,000 cow herd, you end up with 3 cows, okay, that have diarrhea. 66 days in milk is on average the time of culling for those cows that had diarrhea. I'm looking at the period of time that they're in milk. We have a 14-month calving interval. That leaves us the 360 days in milk, actual days in milk. So 3 cows times 360 minus the 66 days when these occurrences happen gives us 882 days lost, okay? So that's the time component of diarrhea lost during the culling portion. Okay, diarrhea, time lost to death, use the same calculations based on annual death loss, percentage of those animals that had deaths or died of deaths, end up in this calculation with 13 cows. Most of them died, or the average death, sorry, was 80 days in milk. We end up with 3,600 days lost. So in total, what you end up with, using this sort of calculation, is 4,500 days in milk lost to diarrhea. Okay? Whole different way of looking at the concept of the impact of disease and really trying to tie culling, death, and morbidity all together, which we tend to fail to do in any practical sense. I'm not going to spend any time on this in terms of going through the numbers, but what this ultimately allows you to do is sort of shift some of the conversation away from just prevalence estimates and start looking on farm data, if you have farms that will work with you to get accurate data, and talk about where should I rank your diseases? Where are those impacts of diseases? And for this particular farm that I pulled up some data from, lameness would be your primary prevalence, but the total DALact rank would actually be mastitis. So, different conversation to have, where should you focus your resources, and what you can ultimately start doing then is talk about that overall time lost in terms of lactations, for instance, which might have more meaning to people. So this is, if I take the total days lost, divide that by the number of days per lactation, these are the types of numbers that I come up with that represent how many lactations I'm ultimately losing per disease, okay? So total lactations lost across just those diseases that I looked at there, 147. So it starts having sort of a different conversation, and what you're ultimately trying to do with that is get the costs associated with that time lost, and then ultimately also look at the costs associated with prevention so that you come up with a cost per DALact averted. That's the end game. You're trying to really tie these two things together so that you can look at how would I avert that and what would that cost be, so that you can allocate your scarce monetary resources, not just on morbidity, but also tied to mortality and culling, while you're helping quantify welfare issues and well-being in the sense of what is that impact of the non-fatal health state, okay? And I think I ran a little long, sorry about that. I have to acknowledge my grad student who did a ton of work on this. Cargill helped support it. I've got a bunch of colleagues that work with me on this, and it's been fantastic. And then ultimately, thank you, if you're here, for helping us with the survey. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Craig, and we had a few spare minutes there. So,
okay.
Sorry. One quick question for Craig before we move on to our last speaker.
Silence.
Okay, then in that case, Craig, thank you very much.
Thanks.